Hi, I'm Reverend Jake Sabe, and welcome to Children's Bible Stories. Alright children, our Bible story for today is going to be the story of Saul's persecution of the church. Now before we get started, when I say Saul, I'm not referring to King Saul. I'm referring to the man who was named Saul, who would later be known as... what, children?
Paul.
Yeah, so Saul was his name before he was a Christian. Now, Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, the same tribe that King Saul came from, and so he probably was named after King Saul. And later, though, when he became a Christian, he started using the name Paul. And so, Paul, before he was a Christian, he was actually an enemy of the church, and he persecuted the church. And our story actually starts with another Bible story, which we haven't done yet, but we should probably do one day, which is the stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. You children know what a martyr is?
No.
That's someone who gets killed for proclaiming the faith. So you're killed because you're a Christian. And Stephen had been preaching a sermon, and he had upset the Jews, and so they were so mad at him that they grabbed him and they dragged him out the city and they stoned him to death. This is where we first learn about the man named Saul. See, as they were dragging Stephen out of the city, they were taking their outer garments off, their coats and stuff, and they tossed their coats at the feet of Saul. So basically say, alright, we're going to go stone this guy. Can you just watch our clothes for us, Saul? And so Saul sat by watching their clothes. And as they stoned Stephen, Luke writes in the Acts of the Apostles that Saul watched on and he approved of the execution. So he thought that this was a good idea. He thought that they should kill Christians. Now, Saul was an interesting man. He was rather young, but he was a genius. He was pretty smart, and because of that, he had risen through the ranks of the Jews, and he was already like a Pharisee in the Jewish people. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was allowed to be a member of the Pharisees and serve as an elder, even though he wasn't old enough. So, Paul had a bit of authority amongst the Jews. He wasn't just an ordinary Jew, he was kind of like a leader amongst the Jews. So after the stoning of Stephen, Saul went around persecuting more Christians. So he went around, probably would have had some other Jews come with him, and Luke says he went from house to house, finding Christians, grabbing men and women and dragging them out of their houses and taking them off and throwing them in prison. Now, in the beginning of Acts chapter 8, Luke only mentions Paul taking the men and women and throwing them in prison. But later, in Acts chapter 9, Luke says Saul was breathing out threats and murder against the Christians. So, Saul wasn't just taking them off to prison to throw them in jail. He was taking them off to prison so that they'd be executed. So Saul was going around and he was arresting Christians and taking them off to jail, and then they probably would have been declared heretics and blasphemy, and they would have been stoned to death. And so Saul was having all the Christians killed because they were preaching that Jesus was the Messiah and that Jesus was God. And is that true, children?
Yes.
Yeah, but the Jews didn't believe that. Especially the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all that. They didn't believe that. And so they thought it was blasphemy. Do you children know what blasphemy is?
No.
Blasphemy is when you speak lies and heresies against God. So when you say something that's not true about God, you say something that's a false teaching, that's blasphemy. And so Saul and the Jews thought that the Christians were committing blasphemy when they said that Jesus was the Messiah and that Jesus had risen from the dead and that Jesus was God. Saul and them thought this was blasphemy. And according to the Old Testament, those who committed blasphemy were to be stoned to death, like what happened to Stephen. As Saul was going around killing all the Christians in Jerusalem, he heard that there was a bunch of Christians over in Damascus. Damascus, as we know in the Old Testament, that was Aram Damascus. That's today we call the land of Syria. And the church was spreading up there because, as we read in chapter 8 of the book of Acts, that's when the deacon Philip went up to the Samaritans and other places like that and started converting a lot of those people to Christianity. And so Saul heard about all these people. He's like, oh no, these Christians aren't just here in Jerusalem, they're spreading all over. So he thought, I've got to go up there and kill them before they spread too far. So Saul went and met with the high priest, and he got permission from the high priest to go to the synagogues in Damascus. Do you children know what a synagogue is?
No, a church.
Yeah, it's like a Jewish church. It's like before we have churches where we gather, the Jews gather in synagogues. Synagogue means gathering, so it's where Jews used to gather for like Saturday services. Kind of like church services, but it's what the Jews did before the Christians came along and started doing church a very similar way. And so Saul got permission from the high priest to go up to Damascus, go into the synagogues, and if he found anyone who was a Christian, man or woman, he was to grab them, arrest them, and drag them back to Jerusalem, where they would be tried for blasphemy, and if they were declared guilty, then they would be stoned to death. And that then, children, is the story of Saul's persecutions of the Christians. In our next video, we're going to tell the story of Saul's conversion. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.